So I shall begin the new session. I am Kostis Smyrlis. I am a researcher at the National Hellenic Research Foundation in Athens. And I would like to remind the audience to mute their microphones and also that they may start posting questions in the chat box for the Q&A session, which will be after my presentation and the presentation of Jonathan. So the author of the book, Jonathan Shea, he received his PhD from the University of Birmingham in 2010. He was working under the supervision of Ruth Makridis, the late Ruth Makridis, and Vridiki Georgantelli. The same year, he moved to Dumbarton Oaks, the research library and collection of Dumbarton Oaks, to study and catalog the Byzantine seal collection there. And he's still working at Dumbarton Oaks as associate curator of coins and seals. He's also teaching Byzantine history at the George Washington University in DC. So his work on the seals of DO, Dumbarton Oaks, has produced a very useful open access online catalog of Byzantine seals. So the book, which is very quickly, I will repeat the title, Politics and Government in Byzantium, The Rise and Fall of the Bureaucrats, 272 pages, published in 2020 by IB Tauris. Concerns, in fact, a very interesting period. From about 966, the last third of the 10th century, to the first third of the 11th century, and the topic, central administration, which is fundamental in any attempt to understand, firstly, how the emperors of the period responded to the various challenges, and ultimately the changing political fortunes of the empire. So this was, as most of you know, a period of immense change between the late 10th and the early 12th century. Byzantium went from expanding on all fronts and reaching the peak of its power to collapse and then economic and political collapse, and then recovery under the Komneni. So there are countless questions that remain to be answered regarding this period. And the most fundamental and almost impossible, I guess, to answer is being why did Byzantium fall so quickly and so low after the middle of the 11th century, approximately. So until recently, scholars have placed the blame squarely on the 11th century rulers and their mismanagement. They're supposed to have spent recklessly on useless projects. They tried to please everybody by giving away grants and dignities while neglecting the emperor's military and defenses. And in this, in fact, modern scholars were basically reproducing the way late 11th century historians, Michael Psellos in particular, explained the political disasters of the time. So this same period also happens to be the golden era for seals. The 11th century has left more seals than any other Byzantine century by far. And seals are an extremely important source when it comes to studying the administration, which lies, the administration, as I already noted, lies at the heart of understanding why Byzantium did so poorly after the 1060s. So Jonathan's book is based on seals, and a large number of them, approximately 2,200. Coming both from the collection of Dumbarton Oaks and other collections in various places. Very briefly on the structure, after a general introduction on the large questions of the period and the source material, Jonathan explores in part 2 the issue of the bureaucrats as individuals and as officials, to move into the main parts of the book, so parts 3 and 4, in which He studies in detail each office of the central administration, analyzing the dignities associated with the various holders or across times. So through this examination, Jonathan is able to draw a number of conclusions, too many to note here, but especially regarding the prestige different offices at given periods enjoyed and the imperial policy implied by this fluctuation. The concluding fifth part brings together the main parts and adds some new insights. And regarding the large question of the collapse of the 11th century, the book argues that the emperors must be exonerated from the charges of overbloating the administration and spending recklessly. Before giving over the mic to Jonathan, I would like to note a number of points that I found of particular interest and which you may want to discuss. Some of the questions I have more, but so one of the questions is the question of the objectivity of the sources, which of seals as sources, which is noted in the book, as opposed to narrative sources. And also the idea that seals offer a window upon individuals otherwise unknown, and that they offer a way to study not only their careers, but also them as individuals, in particular, the way they saw themselves and they present themselves to others. So I shall hand over to Jonathan, and I'll mute my mic.
Thanks, Kostis, for the introduction, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me to participate in this event. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint. There we go, great. So I'm here to talk about my book, Politics and Government in Byzantium. As Kostis said, in the 11th century, it's great. It's full of exciting characters, but if, like me, you want to know how the empire ran, how it worked, it's kind of frustrating. You might expect there's lots of information about such an important period of transition, but that really isn't the case. It's a century when the empire had rapidly expanded, expanding internally, its economy, Constantinople's getting bigger, and then of course it collapses and then recovers again. There's no denying the importance of the events and personalities, and there's no doubt that great changes were underway. But nevertheless, and this is where the frustration comes in, there isn't that much evidence, at least at first glance, about the process of government during this period. We have writings of many contemporary historians who were themselves a part of the imperial bureaucracy. There are letters, archival material, but most of the material that we have that's written on paper, parchment, or whatever, is concerned with government in the provinces and often military matters. Think of the long reign of Basil II. After the civil wars ended, pretty much the entire record concerns his Bulgarian campaigns with a few excursions to Armenia and Syria for variety. Constantinople and the nuts and bolts of how the empire operated at its heart are not mentioned. Knowing that an emperor was gruff and unapproachable and complained that he had to do everything himself does not help us understand how the government actually worked. And as Kostis said, the later sources tend to just say it didn't work, or it was bloated, or it was expensive. Unlike the early 10th century, for which we have the Tactica, those lists of precedents that outline with varying degrees the detail of the state hierarchy, the 11th century provides nothing at all like that. At best, we find out that officers existed and details about the responsibilities of those officials. Now, knowing that an office existed and what its holders did is great, but it tells us very little about its place in government or its importance. Plenty of positions existed under the previous president that are still there under the current president. That doesn't mean that their place in government will remain the same, hopefully. There is, and this is where I should tell you really how my project began. I started work on what would become my book in about 2015, at the suggestion of my friend John Nesbitt, who I work with at Dumbarton Oaks. Thinking that I was sort of idling around the place with nothing to do, he pushed me in the direction of the seals of the judges of the Hippodrome and the judges of the Vellum. In his words, there might be something interesting to say about them. So This is a seal of a judge of the vellum. These are two classes of judges who sat on assorted tribunals in Constantinople. They appeared for the first time in the later 10th century. The whole thing snowballed from there into a broader study of bureaucrats working in Constantinople in the late 10th, 11th, and the very beginning of the 12th century, and of what the structure of government can tell us about the priorities of the emperors and the ways through which they ruled their empire. And this is where I thought about combining what we know from documents with the rather underexploited evidence from seals, these small discs of lead that the Byzantines used to secure their correspondence. From the late 10th through end of the 11th, early 12th centuries, there are 2,497 seals belonging to Constantinopolitan bureaucrats from published collections and the still unpublished parts of the Dumbarton collection. A relatively conservative estimate is that these were struck by 1,741 men, and there are a total of 151 different officers mentioned on seals, for about half of which there's enough material that you can discuss them in some detail, which is what I do in the book. There were pretty strict conventions for the composition of seal inscriptions in this period, and the results can be likened to an email signature. And you can see the pattern here. We know after the invocation, name, title, office. We know their place in the court hierarchy through their title, what job they did, and their name. Generally speaking, the more important an office, the higher the title that went with it. Each seal, as you can see, doesn't provide a lot of information, but that's where having 2,497 separate pieces of evidence comes in handy. You put enough seals together, you can start to build a picture of certain jobs. By looking at the titles associated with an office, you can see its relative importance at the time the seal was struck. Adding together related officers gives us a sense of the makeup and prestige of departments or areas of government, and putting all of that together with the documentary evidence and records of the duties of each office lets us see patterns in how the central administration of the empire operated over a century and a half. The many data points provided by the seals, when combined with written material, allows us to ask and answer questions that neither source could answer alone. And Kostis ran through this already, but you can see the basic structure of the book there. A few things that leapt out at me once I gathered all my data together. I was expecting to see signs of excessive generosity when it came to distributing court titles, particularly once I reached the middle decades of the 11th century. This is what we're told happened. I couldn't find evidence for that, except in a few cases right at the end of the century. I will admit things go crazy in the 1070s and early 1080s. Instead, a much more nuanced picture appeared of careful management of various departments, with some achieving higher status or drifting out of favor as the century progressed. Some drift in and then out of favor. And it's clear that the Byzantine government became more elaborate in the 11th century than it had been for quite some time. I was also struck by how many of these trends that I observed in the data from seals started in the reign of Basil II. He was emperor for such a long time that even with relatively broad dates, which we often have to apply to seals, his reign is visible. And the same could be said to be true of Alexius I at the end of the period. There was a great deal of reform under Basil, particularly in the financial management of the empire and in the beginning of the slow rise of judicial officials to prominence. Also, there's a good case to be made that Basil left a far larger bureaucratic apparatus to his successors than he himself inherited. Much of this isn't clear in traditional sources, but it's very easy to see if you put 2,497 seals next to one another. Because of the sheer number of seals involved, individual officers also stand out. The judges of the vellum and the hippodrome are particularly interesting, just as John predicted. I've put them alongside one another, and you can see the hierarchy on this side. These are the officers held by judges. It's not the complete hierarchy. And the percentage of each type of judge that held it as you progress through the 11th century, vellum and then hippodrome. From an almost identical status, they diverge as time went on, and I have ideas about why that happened. The judiciary as a whole actually underwent a quite remarkable transformation in terms of status and their role in the running of the empire, rising from, in the last of the Tactica to be written, some of the lowest ranked bureaucrats to people at the heart of the empire and the imperial concept of government. Data from seals also suggests that there was a real break at some point in the reign of Alexius I, which is one of the reasons I chose to end my study with this emperor. Not the only reason, but a good one. Not only was the 11th century system substantially reworked during his reign, but the men who held bureaucratic offices were largely excluded from the upper echelons of the imperial hierarchy. And the people who were part of that upper level only very, very rarely held administrative offices. It really boils down to imperial priorities and control. Successive regimes looked at the challenges facing the empire and themselves as the rulers thereof, and modified the bureaucratic apparatus accordingly. They did this not to create a more perfectly functioning government, but to, I think, ensure their control over the empire, to fix perceived flaws. For about a century, successive rulers saw a peculiarly Constantinopolitan bureaucrat-driven form of administration as the best way for them to maintain control and rule Byzantium. And my book highlights how, after decades of conquest and internal growth, the emperors needed a different type of government from that which had evolved over the preceding centuries, and then how that new form of government was itself reshaped to meet the challenges of the late 11th and early 12th centuries. Thank you.